somewhere along the southwestern border of the United States, there is a stretch of land that your GPS refuses to acknowledge. Not a glitch, not a signal issue, a deliberate, engineered silence. Travelers have reported driving through coordinates that don't exist on any commercial mapping platform. Not Google Maps, not Apple Maps, not even the satellite overlays used by independent researchers. The land is there, the roads are there, but according to every digital record available to the public, you are nowhere. That is not an accident. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on something the federal government has never formally acknowledged: a network of anomalous border zones scattered across the American frontier, regions where sovereignty blurs, maps go dark, and the usual rules of civilian oversight simply do not apply. Some researchers call them dead zones. Others use a term that has quietly circulated in certain intelligence-adjacent circles for years: Zone Zero. This is the story of America's silent voids, and once you understand what they are, you'll never look at a map the same way again. Let's start with what we can verify. Under Title 19 of the U.S. Code, federal law enforcement agencies, specifically Customs and Border Protection, are legally authorized to operate without a warrant within 100 miles of any external U.S. boundary. That includes coastlines. That includes international airports. And when you draw that 100-mile buffer around the entire perimeter of the continental United States, you are looking at a zone that encompasses roughly 2/3 of the American population. New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, Miami, all of it falls within this legally ambiguous corridor. Most people have heard this fact and moved on. But here's what they don't tell you. Within that 100-mile corridor, there exist specific subdesignations, operational sectors that receive classifications beyond standard CBP jurisdiction. These aren't published in any press release. They don't appear in congressional testimony. What we know about them comes from a patchwork of FOIA requests, leaked internal memos, and the testimony of former federal contractors who describe, in remarkably consistent terms, zones where normal federal transparency laws are functionally suspended. One former Department of Homeland Security contractor, speaking anonymously to an independent investigative outlet in 2021, described attending a briefing in which certain border sectors were referred to, not by their geographic names, but by numerical designations: Sector 4, Sector 9, and one designation that appeared on no official organizational chart the contractor had ever seen: Zone Zero. The briefing officer, when asked directly what Zone Zero referred to, reportedly said, "That's not a question for this room." That answer tells you more than any map could. To understand how zones like this come to exist, you have to understand a pattern that stretches back decades, a quiet, methodical architecture of executive authority that has been constructed brick by brick since the early Cold War era. In 1950, President Truman signed a series of classified annexes to the Internal Security Act that granted the executive branch sweeping authority to designate certain geographic areas as operationally sensitive, effectively removing them from the standard framework of public accountability. These weren't military bases. These were civilian-adjacent corridors, roads, river crossings, desert stretches that looked like nothing on the surface. Then in the 1980s, something shifted. The Reagan administration, amid escalating concerns about drug trafficking and what internal documents described as non-state incursion vectors, quietly expanded the legal framework for these sensitive zones. Executive Order 12,333, still partially classified to this day, laid the groundwork for intelligence community operations that could extend into domestic border territories under specific threat conditions. The order has been amended multiple times since. The amendments are not fully public. By the time the Department of Homeland Security was created in the aftermath of September 11th, the infrastructure for these zones was already mature. DHS didn't build something new. It inherited something old, and it expanded it dramatically. Former NSA analyst William Binney, one of the most credible whistleblowers in modern intelligence history, stated publicly that post-9/11 domestic surveillance architecture extended into geographic designations that were, in his words, deliberately orphaned from standard oversight chains. Deliberately orphaned. Think about that phrase. Now here's where the story gets strange in ways that even the most skeptical observer struggles to dismiss. In 2019, a team of independent cartographers, hobbyists, and academics collaborating through an open-source geographic platform began a project to compare commercial map data with publicly available satellite imagery along the U.S.-Mexico border. What they expected to find were minor discrepancies, rendering errors, outdated imagery. What they actually found was something that caused several members of the team to go silent and, in at least 2 documented cases, to delete their contributions to the project entirely. In 3 distinct geographic areas along the southern border, one in Arizona, one in New Mexico, and one in a remote stretch of southern Texas, the satellite imagery available through commercial platforms showed terrain that was fundamentally inconsistent with the topographic data in federal geographic databases, hills that didn't match their recorded elevations, a river tributary that appeared in satellite images but was absent from every hydrological survey conducted since 1990. And, most disturbingly, in the Arizona location, a series of structures, not natural formations, structures, low profile, geometric, consistent in spacing, the kind of layout that to anyone familiar with signals intelligence infrastructure looks unmistakably deliberate. When the cartographers attempted to cross-reference the coordinates with FAA flight restriction data, they discovered that a no-fly zone, not publicized, not listed in standard aeronautical databases, but verifiable through back-channel pilot communications, existed directly over the Arizona site. A no-fly zone over a stretch of desert that officially contains nothing. One member of the cartography group, before going dark, posted a single statement to the project's forum. It read, "I've been asked to stop. I'm complying, but I want it on record that what we found is real, and someone with significant resources does not want it discussed." The post was archived by 3 independent users before it was removed. So what are these zones really? Let's move through the serious possibilities, because this is where the investigation stops being abstract and starts having real implications. The first possibility is that these are nodes in a next-generation surveillance network, one that operates below the publicly acknowledged tier of border technology. We know that CBP has deployed autonomous surveillance towers along the southern border, built by companies like Anduril Industries, using AI-driven threat detection. What we don't know is the full extent of the data infrastructure supporting those systems. Signals have to go somewhere. Data has to be processed somewhere. And in an era where edge computing allows for massive, localized data processing, it is entirely plausible, not conspiratorial, plausible, that certain border zones serve as dark nodes in a surveillance mesh that the public has never been briefed on. The second possibility is more unsettling. Some researchers who have studied these anomalies over the long term believe that certain zones exist not primarily for surveillance, but for negotiation. Sovereign voids, spaces where formal jurisdiction is deliberately ambiguous, have historically been used as off-the-books meeting grounds for intelligence exchanges, cartel-adjacent informant management, and even state-level back-channel diplomacy, a place where something can happen, and officially, nothing happened. The absence from the map isn't a technical issue, it's the entire point. The third possibility is the one that the government's own patterns of behavior make hardest to dismiss. These zones may be laboratories, testing grounds for surveillance doctrine, autonomous enforcement systems, and population response protocols that cannot be ethically or legally tested in acknowledged spaces. When a technology or a tactic is too legally ambiguous to deploy openly, you deploy it in a place that doesn't officially exist. You study the results, and then, quietly, you scale it. The history of American clandestine programs, COINTELPRO, MKUltra, Operation Mockingbird, tells us one consistent truth. The government has never lacked the will to conduct operations in spaces designed to evade accountability. The only thing that changes is the technology available to do it. Here's what we're left with. A legal framework that carves out enormous swaths of American soil from standard civilian oversight. A documented pattern of geographic anomalies that multiple independent investigators have encountered and been pressured to stop examining. Structures that exist in satellite imagery and nowhere else. And a single term, Zone Zero, that surfaces in the accounts of former insiders and then disappears, like a coordinate scrubbed from a map. We are not telling you what to believe. We are telling you what the evidence suggests. And what it suggests is that somewhere along the silent edges of this country, in the desert heat and the river fog and the unmarked stretches between official points on a map, something is operating quietly, continuously, without your knowledge or your consent. The question isn't whether these zones exist. The evidence is too consistent, too corroborated, too geometrically impossible to be coincidence. The question is, what are they watching for? And perhaps more importantly, what are they watching? If that question unsettles you, it should. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And if you want to follow this investigation as it continues, because this story is far from over, subscribe now. The next chapter goes even deeper, and trust me, you won't want to miss it.